Okay, hi everyone, and welcome to this webinar for the release of the latest tranche of Brightline Watch data. My name is Rob Blair. I'm an associate professor of political science and international and public affairs at Brown University. I'm here mainly in my role as co-founder and co-director of the Democratic Erosion Consortium, which is a global network of scholars, students, policymakers, practitioners, and donors engaged in efforts to try to understand and hopefully mitigate threats to democracy in the US and abroad through a combination of research, teaching, policy engagement, and public outreach. And if any of you in the audience are interested in learning more or getting involved in the consortium, I hope you'll please drop me a line or visit our website. That, I promise, is the end of my self-promotion. We're really here because American democracy is experiencing a crisis of institutional stability and legitimacy. Norms that we have long taken for granted are being questioned, weakened, and in some cases discarded altogether. Institutions that once seemed stable now seem dangerously rickety. Some of our most prominent political leaders are actively undermining the democratic process and diminishing citizens' trust in that process. And all the while, controversies over issues like gerrymandering, election security, access to the ballot box, et cetera, continue to fester. And part of what makes it so difficult to address this crisis is that it's unfolding slowly and in some cases quite insidiously. So there probably isn't going to be a single bright line that we as a country are going to cross where we can say that we are unambiguously not a democracy anymore. Instead, we're likely to cross many somewhat dimmer lines that aren't necessarily indicative of a collapse into autocracy, but that nonetheless signal a continued subversion of our democratic norms and institutions. So being vigilant about the health of American democracy requires paying close attention to these subtler, more gradual ways that democracy is changing and in many respects decaying. And I think that's what makes the work that Brightline Watch is doing so important and unique. So Brightline Watch has brought together a group of political scientists to monitor democratic practices and their resilience and to track potential threats to democracy in the US. They have published results from 17 waves of surveys of the American public and of experts on American history and politics going back to 2017. They are doing the hard work of monitoring threats to democracy much more continuously and at a much more granular level than any other data collection effort that I'm aware of. They've also hosted several conferences and published several academic publications based on the data they've been collecting. Their work has been featured in numerous media accounts of the challenges confronting American democracy, including the New York Times, the Washington Post, the LA Times, other venues. I, for one, am very eager to hear what we can learn from their latest round of data collection, and I'm sure you in the audience are as well. So without further ado, let me introduce the panelists. So we have three panelists from Brightline Watch with us today. First is Gretchen Humke. She is a professor and chair of political science at the University of Rochester. Her research focuses on Latin America, political instability, and the rule of law. Her most recent book is Institutions on the Edge, The Origins and Consequences of Interbranch Crises in Latin America, which was published in 2017 with Cambridge University Press. She's been a visiting scholar at the Kellogg Institute at the University of Notre Dame, the Weatherhead Center for International and Area Studies at Harvard, and the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars in Washington, D.C. We also have with us John Carey. John is the Wentworth Professor in the Social Sciences at Dartmouth College, where he also serves as Associate Dean of Faculty for the Social Sciences. His research focuses on representation and democratic institution. His books include Campus Diversity, The Hidden Consensus, published with Cambridge in 2019, Legislative Voting and Accountability, also published with Cambridge in 2009, and Presidents and Assemblies, published with Cambridge in 1992, and he is a member of the Academy of Arts and Sciences. And finally, we have Brendan Nyhan. Brendan is a professor of government at Dartmouth College. His research focuses on misperceptions about politics and healthcare. His work has been published, as best I can tell, in every peer-reviewed journal there is. That includes the American Journal of Political Science, the British Journal of Political Science, the Journal of Politics, Medical Care. This list is longer than I care to read. He is also a contributor to The Upshot at the New York Times. And I should also mention Sue Stokes of the University of Chicago isn't on the panel today, but she is one of the four Brightline Watch co-founders with Gretchen, John, and Brendan, and sort of the fourth musketeer in absentia to our panel today. So what we're going to do, so Gretchen, John, and Brendan are going to be presenting some results from the most recent waves of the Brightline Watch survey, including the most recent wave, which hasn't even been made publicly available yet, I don't believe. I'll then pose a question or two to the panelists, and I'll be collecting questions from the audience. So if those of you in the audience have questions that you'd like to ask the panelists, you can use this Q&A feature here. We'll be collecting them as the talks go on, and then I'll pose them at the end. Okay, so without further ado, let me turn it over to Gretchen.
Great, thank you so much. Welcome, everybody. We are really excited to be able to share the latest results of our survey. As Rob mentioned, we have done 17 survey reports, and we are going to be presenting some of the results from our 18th survey in just a moment. This is the first time, though, that we have presented those in this kind of a forum where we can get feedback from the audience quickly. So we're just really happy for the opportunity to do this. This election that we just experienced was really an important event in American politics. It was the first test of American democracy since the 2020 elections, since January 6th. So there was a lot of expectations, a lot of concerns about what would happen in the midterm election. So I just wanted to set the stage before John and Brendan, my colleagues at Brightline Watch, talk about some of the surveys that we did after the midterm election. I want to set the stage by talking about what we were seeing right on the eve of the 2022 midterm elections, where we fielded both an expert survey, where we send a survey to all political scientists working at universities in the United States, as well as a public survey, which was fielded about a month before the 2022 surveys. And just sort of a word before I share some of the results from those surveys about Brightline Watch. You know, American democracy has always faced a number of challenges, you know, including the problem of gerrymandering, equal access to voting, campaign finance, you know, campaign finance laws. But in 2016, for those of us who hadn't really focused our academic careers on the United States, 2016 represented sort of a watershed, I think, for a lot of observers of American politics, where suddenly we had a campaign where one of the candidates was, at least rhetorically, posing a lot of challenges to American democracy that we had seen. For those of us who study other parts of the world, we had seen threats like this in other parts of the world, but it really did represent a break with norms of American democracy. And that was really the main driver for founding Brightline Watch back in 2016. And since then, we have been fielding both expert and public surveys, sometimes 3 times a year, sometimes 4 times a year, to really get a sense of perceptions about how democracy is performing in a very kind of disaggregated way. So if I could just show the first slide. So I wanted to start with the battery of questions that we have been asking, more or less the same battery, since we began fielding these surveys in 2017. And I wanted to just compare the responses we got from our very first survey that we did in 2017 to the survey that we ran in October, and focus primarily on fraud-free elections, which is highlighted in this graph. So we have about 28 principles that we routinely poll on, and fraud-free elections, so the idea that elections are free and fair, just routinely and consistently comes up as the most important principle of a democracy, both among experts and among the public. And I should say that, as we'll see in a lot of the results I'm going to present, Democrats and Republicans don't agree on a lot of things, but they have pretty consistently agreed that this is really the kind of foundational principle of American democracy. What I want to highlight here is that there has been, since we started polling, a gap between the importance of this principle and the performance of this principle. So if we look on the left-hand side of the screen, those are the results from the 2017 survey. If you look at that row on fraud-free elections, you'll notice two things. One is that just about a little bit more than a majority of Americans think that elections are fraud-free. But at least at that point in time, both Democrats and Republicans, there wasn't a whole lot of daylight between Republicans and Democrats there. That said, I should say that if we think back to 2017, the narratives for why free and fair elections were being compromised was really different on the left and the right, right? This was after allegations of Russian interference in the election that was likely driving the concern among Democrats, whereas this specter of fraudulent voting that's been raised by the Republicans and really came into the forefront in 2020, that was being raised, as you'll all remember, back in the 2016 elections. If we fast forward to 2022 and look at fraud-free elections, what we see is this really gigantic gap between Democrats and Republicans that has opened up. So Republicans have lost a lot of confidence in elections, and Democrats have gained quite a bit of confidence in the performance of elections. We could just see the next slide. So drilling down on this, the sort of specific question about the 2020 election that a lot of observers, including us, have been tracking is the extent to which the public sees Biden as the legitimate or rightful winner of the US. And two things to note here. One is that 2/3 of the American public thinks that Biden is the legitimate winner, but there is this gigantic partisan gap between Democrats and Republicans. That gap started in right after the 2020 election. It remained virtually unchanged until last November 2021, and then it softened just a little bit right leading up to the midterm elections, with slightly more Republicans being willing to accept Biden as the rightful winner. But still, there is a huge gap in terms of the legitimacy of the 2020 election. We could see the next slide. So we decided to ask people not just what had happened in 2020 and what they thought about that, or what they still thought about it, but also what their confidence looked like in terms of whether their vote would be counted as intended in the 2022 midterm elections. And a couple of interesting patterns here to note. One is that both for Democrats and Republicans, there is quite a bit more confidence, both that their own votes will be counted as intended and that votes within their state will be counted as intended, but less confidence that across the nation votes will be counted as intended. And the other sort of stark difference to note here again is that partisan gap between Democrats, 80% having confidence that votes are going to be counted as intended in the 2022 midterm elections, compared to just about 50% of Republicans thinking that votes are going to be counted as intended. I should say we'd fielded this question before, and like we saw on the previous slide, Republican confidence was a lot lower than Democrats, but it has been inching up a little bit as we approach the 2022 midterms. We could just see the next slide. So in the wake of the 2020 election, given the doubts among the Republican voters that the election was free and fair, given the sort of constant rhetoric coming out of Mar-a-Lago and former President Trump declaring that the election was stolen from him, perhaps it wasn't surprising that we had a lot of candidates running in the 2022 election who were running on not necessarily their entire platform, but certainly declaring that the 2020 election was fraudulent. So here in our 17th report, we compiled from a number of sources, from 538, from Bloomberg, and from Washington Post, data on the candidates who were coded as 2020 election deniers. And what you can see here is that for Republican candidates running for state offices, right, a little bit more than a third for Attorney General, Secretary of State, were running as an election denier, and that number was even higher for governor. About half of Republican candidates running on this platform. Some variation in terms of the counting on U.S. House of Representatives, and about 35 to 41% of U.S. Senate. So if I can just see the next slide. Yeah, okay. So this was rated by our experts, so by political scientists across the country. This fact of 40% of Republican candidates rejecting the 2020 election in the midterm elections. This was regarded as one of the most important and abnormal events that we have really ever seen in American politics. So, you know, we also had other things on the list, right? The Trump fake elector scheme, the FBI finding secret documents at Mar-a-Lago, Trump announcing plans for January 6th pardons, et cetera, et cetera. But this really stands out, and actually going back to some of our earlier polling on events like the Mueller investigation and the Ukrainian investigation in particular, this really stands out as one of the most important and abnormal events that we have seen in American politics. And I think, you know, the reason that it's so important, right, is that going back again to this idea that fraud-free elections are really the basis of any democracy, including American democracy. The idea is that parties have to be willing to lose elections. And the fact that this has been challenged in such a fundamental way was really seen by people as quite alarming. So if we could just go to the next slide. In contrast to this, and I think this is especially interesting, we did see that many of the voters actually thought that losing candidates should concede elections, right? So this is a question not on performance, it's a question on how important this principle is. There's some gap, again, between Democrats and Republicans, but much less than we had seen previously. So about 94% of Democrats thought that it was important for losing candidates to concede, compared to you know, 80% of Republicans. And these numbers for both Democrats and Republicans have gone up a lot since we polled right after the 2020 election. So I think I am out of time. I have a few more slides, but let me leave it here and let me turn it over to John and Brendan.
All right, I think I'm going to pick it up here. Stu, if you're able to switch over to the other slides. So John and I are going to speak about the 2022, November 2022 survey results. These are preliminary, and they may change slightly between now and when we formally release a report, but you're getting an exclusive sneak preview of these findings. So picking up where Gretchen left off, what we'll be describing for you is what we've found so far when we looked at the data from both our expert survey respondents, so political scientists at departments, university and college departments around the country, and our nationally representative public sample, how they both responded to the outcome of the 2022 election, what interesting changes we've seen, what sorts of findings we're exploring. So again, caveat that these are preliminary findings. Okay, next slide. So what I'll be speaking about in the first part of this section is about confidence in elections, broadly defined, and I'll show you some different measures of that. And then John will be talking about the overall performance of U.S. democracy as well as potential threats to it. So if we can go to the next slide. So this is picking up where Gretchen began, if I recall correctly, looking at perceptions of whether Joe Biden was the rightful winner of the 2020 election. And again, I want to focus for a moment just on the period on the left side of the graph before the recent events that we focus on the right, the survey we did immediately before the election and then the survey we did immediately afterwards. It's important to note there just how stable those perceptions were in that November 2020 to November 2021 period. There was a very long time after that election that even as the evidence accumulated that Joe Biden was in fact the rightful winner, public perceptions were not changing materially. They were incredibly stable through that period, most notably stable at a very concerning level among Republicans, suggesting the way that Donald Trump had kind of poisoned the well, creating a stable misperception about the fraudulence of the 2020 election that was interfering with the legitimacy that we depend on in a democracy to secure the peaceful transfer of power. So we had Republican acceptance of Biden's victory at approximately 1 in 4 Republicans, as you can see there. And that's putting a real floor on how high the overall acceptance of Biden's victory could be among the public as a whole, which is what's indicated in purple there. So what we saw, as Gretchen showed in the pre-election period, was that uptick in especially Republicans, who you can see were about 6 percentage points more likely to say Joe Biden was probably or definitely the rightful winner in 2020. And notably, what we're seeing in the preliminary data is a further slight increase up to about 37%, right? So now we're talking about a 10 percentage point increase with respect to a year ago among Republicans. So that's very encouraging. We can talk about different reasons we might have found that effect, whether it's something about how Republicans process the outcome of the 2022 election or the messages they've been getting from elites. There's different kinds of stories you could think about there, but we do think it's noteworthy. And a theme that you'll hear in the presentation of these new survey results is there's a kind of good news and bad news component to all of them. The good news is those numbers really are moving in the direction we would hope for the stability of American democracy. On the other hand, they're still far too low. We shouldn't be comforted by the fact that the opposition party, only now 4 in 10 of them accept the validity of the presidential election that they just lost, right? In any other context, that would have been a very concerning number, even though in the current one, it counts as good news. Okay, next slide. So picking up on another statistic that Gretchen shared with you, we disaggregate by level of elections, our measure of the confidence people have in the election count. And what you see here is the change from immediately before the 2022 election to afterwards that respondents expressed by party at both the state and national level. And what you can see is at the state level, we see higher levels of confidence in general, consistent with what Gretchen showed you. And there's a relatively parallel trend of Democrats and Republicans expressing slightly more confidence in their state election results afterwards compared to before. Whereas at the national level, we have something a little bit more heterogeneous. It looks like Democrats' confidence increased relatively more. Republicans were largely flat. And what we're seeing there on the right looks like something political scientists call a winner's effect, where the side that won suddenly decides that the election system is better than they thought or more trustworthy after all. So that actually, in a way, is a kind of reassuring outcome, because it's the kind of outcome that we observe in the aftermath of an election that isn't contested by the losing party, as we saw, for instance, after the November 2020 election. So in this case, the absence of systematic contestation of the results, the widespread acceptance of defeat by even election denier candidates, we don't see that decline that we might have feared on the Republican side, at least if those allegations had gotten traction. Okay, next slide. And then the final graph that I'll show you before I hand things over to John it is looking at perceptions of the frequency of fraud via different methods. So one thing that we wanted to do in our research, and we've been tracking, is perceptions of how much fraud there is. Sometimes people are vague about this. So we really try to pin our respondents down to say, basically, what is the order of magnitude of the number of votes you think are changed by fraud by different methods? And there's a scale from basically, fewer than 10 to millions. And what you're seeing here are the percentage of folks who say thousands or more votes were changed via each of the 6 identified methods. And those results are further disaggregated by party. And what we're looking at is how did perceptions of the prevalence of fraud change by party between when we're looking first on the left of each subfigure in the immediate aftermath of the November 2020 election, and then on the right of each subfigure in the immediate aftermath of the November 2022 election. And encouragingly, what you see is a downward trend in perceptions of the prevalence of fraud among Republicans, the group that's by far the most likely to express high levels of belief in widespread voter fraud, which is something that we have no systematic evidence for. So there are reasonably parallel declines across the 5 measures that we collected in both elections. That's encouraging. Again, though, I would say even those somewhat lower levels we observe in the November 2022 data are still uncomfortably high. And again, vastly outstrip any credible estimate based on expert judgments or criminal proceedings. Finally, on the bottom right, you can see some data where we added in this round of elections, trying to capture beliefs that voting machine software itself was the mechanism of fraud. You can see that those are also relatively widespread. Okay, let me hand it over to John.
Great. Thanks, Brendan. Let's get to the next slide. And so the next set of slides I'm going to show you all focus more broadly, stepping back from confidence in individual elections and focus on the performance of American democracy more broadly. Let's take a look at the next slide, please. Great, thanks. So now we've got a long time series back to the origin of Brightline Watch. We started these surveys in 2017, and we've asked in each of those surveys, we've asked our respondents, both our experts and our public sample, to rate the performance of democracy in the United States on a 100-point scale. All right, so hundreds better democracy and zero is much worse. And you can see there's a lot of stability over time, but I want to focus your attention on the two areas bracketed by these ovals. One is we did October and November surveys in 2020. That is just before and just after the 2020 election, and we did that again in 2022. And if you look at the 2020 election, what we see is what's consistent with what Brendan had referred to as a winner's effect. That is, among partisans, from October to November, Republicans diminished their assessment of the performance of democracy, and Democrats increased them. And overall, among the public, the effect was a wash. The public's overall assessment didn't change. In 2022, something that we see, which is, I think, kind of encouraging, is that both Democrats and Republicans, as well as the public overall, naturally, and up top, the green line, the experts, everybody increased their assessment of the performance of American democracy between October and November. So again, the performance ratings aren't necessarily as high as we might hope, but they're moving in the right direction. And that's a little different from a standard winner's effect, where the sort of winning party increases and the losing party diminishes its satisfaction with democracy. It may be a product of the quality of the elections overall. It may be partly a result of the fact that it's not really straightforward who was the winning party and who was the losing party in the 22 elections, right? The Republicans can claim victory in the House, but I think Democrats, by and large, exceeded expectations. At any rate, that's a new phenomenon and an encouraging one. Let's take a look at the next slide, please. So in addition to asking our respondents to rate democracy at present, we also, in the October and the November surveys, we asked them to project 5 years and 10 years into the future. And so what do you think the democracy rating for the United States will be 5 years out and 10 years out? And so what we've got here, these pairs of lines, the solid lines reflect assessments that were done in October as of October, and then +5 and +10. And the dotted lines show the analogous projections or current ratings and then projections as of November after the election. And so consistent with what I showed you in the previous slide, each group's assessment of democracy at present has nudged up a little bit. And the other thing you can see is that their corresponding projections 5 years and 10 years out have also nudged up a little bit. People are a little bit less optimistic about the future than they are about the present. So by and large, those projections diminish a little bit, but not a ton. And you can see that, people seem to be a little bit more optimistic as a whole. The experts certainly are. The public overall is. Democrats a little bit more optimistic, and Republicans are really indistinguishable. So their current assessment went up a little bit, and their projections are pretty much indistinguishable between October and November. Let's take a look at the next slide. Okay, now another version of projection I'm going to show you. We asked each of the respondents, what do you think the US will be like in 5 years in terms of democracy? And then we asked them 3 additional questions. First one is, imagine Joe Biden is the re-elected president in 2024. Now tell me what you think the state of US democracy will be in 5 years. Second question is, imagine Ron DeSantis is elected in 2024, and they project 5 years out. And the last one is, imagine Donald Trump is elected again to the presidency in 2024, and asking again for that 5-year projection. So this plot shows, for the experts in green on the left-hand side, they expect and they project an increase in the quality of American democracy if Biden were elected, a decrease with that D for DeSantis, and then a precipitous decrease if Trump were reelected in 2024. And if we move to the purple the cluster of dots there, that's the public's overall assessments. There, they don't really distinguish between a blank scenario in which you just ask them to project and a scenario in which Biden is the winner in 2024. But they do anticipate, on the whole, diminish quality of democracy if DeSantis is elected, and further diminished quality of democracy if Trump were. And of course, here among Democrats and Republicans, the blue and the red dots, we see what we would expect, I think, sort of mirror images of each other. Democrats expect democracy to improve if Biden's elected, but to drop off precipitously under both DeSantis and Trump. And for Republicans, the expectations are exactly the reverse. They would anticipate a diminishment of democracy under a Biden second term, and an improvement in democracy under either DeSantis or Trump. Okay. I'm going to take a look at one more slide, I think, and we're going to shift focus here to the experts only. In this last slide we're about to show you, we asked the experts a battery of questions. We said, we want you to consider a number of scenarios, some of which have actually happened and some of which might happen in the near future. And we want you to evaluate first, if this were to happen, or given that it's happened, do you think of this as a threat to democracy or a benefit to democracy, or had no effect on American democracy? And then if they answered threat, we asked them to make a finer graded evaluation. If they answered benefit, we asked them to make a finer graded evaluation about the nature or the extent of the benefit. And so this plot combines a lot of information, but really what you can see, we've organized it from the scenarios that the experts regarded as most threatening up top to those that they regarded as potentially most beneficial down below. And on the right-hand side of the figure, those gray bars show you the proportion of experts who didn't think a given scenario would have any impact overall on the quality of American democracy. And so, you can read through the shorthand descriptions of what each of the scenarios were, but you can see, focusing your attention on the top bar and then a few bars down, the experts regard a Trump nomination for the presidency and as a Republican candidate in 2024 as overwhelmingly a strong threat, serious or extraordinary threat to American democracy, and very few of them have no opinion about that. If you skip down a few and you look at the analog, the DeSantis nomination for the presidency in 2024, still those that think that that would have an impact on democracy overwhelmingly think that it would be a potential threat. But just as important, I think, is if you look at the right-hand side of the screen there, almost half of the respondents there don't think of a DeSantis nomination in 2024 as necessarily a threat or a benefit to democracy. I won't walk through each of them, but you can look and you can see the idea of Biden being impeached is regarded as a threat. The next one I do want to focus on just for a second, and this is a scenario you probably read about in the news, that Democrats had given money during Republican primaries to Republican candidates, in many cases who were supporters of the big lie, in anticipation of yielding a weaker general election candidate as an opponent for Democrat. Our experts predominantly thought that this strategy was a threat to American democracy. I know even though the strategy may have worked, those candidates by and large won their Republican primaries and lost in the general elections. And I suspect there are some Democratic strategists who would say this was a successful strategy. You can see that our experts overall put the partisan considerations aside and regarded that strategy as threatening to democracy. And then the only other two that I'm going to take time to note here, because I want to open this up, is the two items in the middle of the chart that refer to Hunter Biden. One of which has already happened, and we asked people about Facebook's decision to limit access to the Hunter Biden laptop story in the run-up to the 2020 election. The respondents were about evenly divided, those that had a response on whether that was a threat, 15%, or a benefit to American democracy, 26%. But I think just as interesting there is that a majority of respondents didn't regard that to have had any impact on American democracy. And the item just below, instead of being retrospective, is forward-looking. This is the prospect of House of Representatives investigations into Hunter Biden's finances, which I think we can all with great confidence anticipate in the next year or so. Overwhelmingly, our respondents did not think that that would have an impact on American democracy one way or another. And then you probably have been reading ahead and drawing your own conclusions about the bottom four items that are mostly regarded as assets or benefits to democracy by our experts. I'll stop here so we have plenty of time for questions and responses from the audience. Thanks.
Okay, thank you so much, Gretchen, Brendan, and John. So I want to kick off by asking sort of a meta question about Brightline Watch's work, and it's related to the question that Katie Hogue, Katie, I apologize if I'm mispronouncing your last name, but the question that Katie posed in the Q&A, and I'm going to, I guess, invite you to do sort of a bit of navel gazing here before we dig into the details of the survey. So I'm wondering how we can ensure that expert perspectives on American democracy remain relevant at a time when expertise itself is increasingly under attack. And, you know, I don't have data on this, but I'd be willing to wager that most American political scientists probably fall somewhere on the left side of the political spectrum. I don't know if you guys have data on this, but I'd be willing to wager that's probably true of the experts in your panel survey as well. And as Katie points out, right, their views tend to align quite closely with the views of Democrats in the public. And, you know, I guess there's a risk here that political scientists and perhaps academics more generally will come to be seen, if they're not already, as just sort of the intellectual arm of the Democratic Party. And that risk seems to have become more obvious and problematic since 2016, when, you know, many expert political scientists spoke out forcefully against Donald Trump, and when Donald Trump made, you know, disdain of expertise a very central part of his populist appeal. So I wonder sort of, you know, to what extent do you think we should be worrying about this? Is it a problem? Does it matter? How do you guys think about this in terms of the work that Brightline Watch is doing?
I spoke about the experts, so I'll follow up briefly, but I think both of my colleagues should jump in. In answer to Katie's specific question, do we have data on the personal political affiliation of the individual expert respondents? The answer is no. And, you know, we made a kind of a contract with our experts when we founded Brightline Watch, which was that we were going to be back in their inbox on a regular basis, asking for their time and attention. And we wanted to make it very clear that we were doing that we're kind of taxing our friends and colleagues that way because we value their expertise. And we hope that they bring to a perspective that we can't get in other kinds of surveys. And, as a result, we can ask the experts about things that you can't realistically, feasibly ask a public sample. But we've stuck with that commitment. So we never ask the individual experts what their partisanship is. Now, you're right, Rob. There are plenty of other studies out there about partisan distributions among academics, including among political scientists. And I think there's every reason to believe that they're overwhelmingly, to the extent they're partisan, they have partisan ID, that they're Democrats. But we don't ask, and we do that. That was a conscious decision from the outset.
If I can just follow up too, one of the things that we try to flag in the reports are how similar the experts' opinions and answers are to the respondents who identify as Democratic. And we do see quite a bit of difference on some measures. So for example, the data that John presented on the sort of overall evaluation of American democracy, I think something that we've been finding over and over again is that experts are actually much more optimistic about American democracy, certainly than either Republicans or Democrats, and the identity of the optimism and how they rank democracy changed in 2020. But the experts have just been consistently more optimistic about the state of American democracy. And we sort of attribute that to their expertise in the sense that they're putting American democracy in a much broader comparative context, not just looking longitudinally at American democracy, but comparing it to other parts of the world. So over and over again, for all of the principles, we're disaggregating experts from the public respondents on the basis of partisanship. But I think particularly for that overall measure, you really do see some differences between Democratic responders and the experts.
Okay, so I want to dig into one of the specific results that you guys presented. So the sort of diminished belief in the frequency of voter fraud across all these different, the varieties of voter fraud that you all measured, and that seems to be really good news because we know that there's just not a lot of evidence that this sort of voter fraud occurs, or at least in large numbers. And I'm just curious, and I'm asking you to speculate a bit here, but to think about what could be driving this. So Brendan, one explanation that you mentioned that seems certainly potentially relevant here is just the relative absence of Republican candidates in particular claiming fraud in 2022, and you see that it's the the Republican respondents in particular who seem to be becoming more more confident in American elections. Another potential explanation is all the changes to election laws that were passed between 2020 and 2022. So maybe these folks are living in states where election laws changed in ways that I think a lot of, again, expert political scientists would say are sort of overly constraining access to the ballot box, but that many respondents could view as really salutary for the health of their elections. So I'm curious, and this actually is getting at a question that Olivier, whose last name I will definitely mispronounce, Bergeron-Boutin, that he raised as well. So I wonder if you have variation, can you get at sort of state by state responses? Can you see if that improvement in Republican perceptions is happening overwhelmingly in states that passed these sorts of laws? Of course, it would just be suggestive, but I'd be curious to know. And then I'm more generally curious to hear your thoughts on anything else that could be driving those trends.
Yeah, thanks. It's a great question. And the elite, I zeroed in on the elite communication because I think the evidence is strongest in that case. Both, descriptively what we saw with Trump around the 2020 election, and then experimentally, my colleagues and I have done two studies where we exposed people to voter fraud claims, and we found that exposure to these voter fraud claims from Republicans differentially drove up perceptions of fraud and drove down confidence in the election system among Republicans. So we have evidence from that in the aftermath of the 2018 election and in the lead up to the 2020 election, demonstrating that mechanism. So, that's where I think we have the strongest causal evidence. But, your idea there about the changes in election laws is an important one. And it's even a case where a null effect where we find no change would be important to show. And that's certainly something that we could test with our data. There are some limitations because our state level samples are often relatively small. So we have to be cautious in our interpretation, but we could certainly look at the relationship between changes in state election law and changes in election confidence versus the aftermath of the 2020 election. That's a neat idea for our report. So we'll definitely think about that. And as Olivier is actually our research associate working with us on Brightline Watch, and he's investigating also the relationship with the state level outcomes themselves. Are we seeing state level winners and losers effects happening, depending how things turned out, for instance, in prominent statewide races?
Great. And Olivia, I apologize. I didn't realize that you were part of the team here. Okay, so let me pick up another question from the audience. So this is again a sort of meta question about the work that you guys are doing. But so Larry Broser asks, do you feel the surveys are accurately reflecting groups that feel marginalized and seem to have been missed in recent election polling? Obviously, this has been a big topic among all sorts of pollsters. So curious to hear sort of methodologically from you guys, how do you manage that issue?
Should I talk about that as the American politics person? Okay, there, my colleagues are nodding. So we face the constraints that everyone does in terms of the challenges of doing the highest possible quality survey work in a context where it's very difficult to reach people, and there may be people who are systematically opting out of polling in ways that are hard for us to understand. The industry has been struggling with this since 2016, as I think the audience is familiar with. The story, I'll give you two answers here. The first is that our comparisons of November 2020 to November 2022 hopefully hold that relatively fixed. We're using the same survey company with essentially the same methodology in both elections, right? So as we're thinking about changes in our the measures we're using, as long as YouGov isn't becoming differentially more or less accurate, differentially covering those folks or not, then hopefully those over time comparisons should be instructive regardless. And the second point I'll offer is that YouGov had, according to a tabulation that was done by Drew Linzer, who's a pollster, YouGov, its 2022 polls had above average accuracy relative to the set of pollsters he considered. So the average absolute error in, I think it was Senate and governor races was on the order of 3 to 4 percentage points, so quite good. So that is reassuring that hopefully we're getting a high quality sample. It's certainly not perfect though, and we very much take the point that there are real challenges in this area.
If I could just underscore something Brendan said, all of those caveats aside, I think the fact that most of our attention is on the longitudinal data and we're not really shifting who we're sampling, I think that those conclusions don't change because of the focus on the change over time. So we may be limited in terms of our ability to draw inferences across general population, but in terms of making comparisons over time, we're in pretty good shape to do that.
Great. So just another sort of broad question here. I'm really struck by the projected ratings of US democracy over time. And struck because I guess they're not really as bad as I thought they would be. I would have expected to see people feeling much more pessimistic about how things will look 5-10 years hence. And maybe this is sort of a reflection of what I was saying at the start of the panel, that democracy erodes slowly, so people are projecting out a slow erosion. But I'm just curious, on this point in particular, to what extent were you surprised by this? Does this seem like kind of good news to you? And then more generally, are there results that maybe not this one specifically, but are there other results that really surprised you, that sort of stood out from this latest wave?
I'll jump in and offer that, Rob. I share your surprise. Sorry, about the projections. They were not as pessimistic as I might have expected. Maybe that's from spending too much time on Twitter or too much time around other political scientists. It's like every time we think of a new survey question, my first reaction is to regret that we didn't think of it 5 years ago. And I wish we had thought to ask that project into the future question 5 years ago, because I think there was a little more of an apocalyptic sense, certainly at many moments during the past 5 years. We'll probably try to keep that in the hopper and ask it going forward. But yeah, I do wish we'd been asking it for a while.
If I could just add something, Oh, sorry. I hadn't seen the Wave 18 until they presented it just a few minutes ago. So I was really surprised and sort of heartened by the fact that those red lines for Republicans are not tilting downward, right? Because that's what we saw in 2020 before and after the election, when we ran the surveys in October before 2020 and in November of 2020, we saw a real decline in Republican confidence. So the fact that, it wasn't a red wave, so the Republicans didn't perform as well as was anticipated, and yet still confidence is actually increasing or steady and not decreasing. To me, that's surprising and also really encouraging.
And Rob, if I could just take, extend this for one more level, we're talking about the survey results, but I want to come back to the elite communication that I postulated was so important, and just say, I don't think we understand well why the flows have been so weak, the information flows to the American people claiming that there was widespread fraud, that we should reject the results of the 2022 election. I was struck by how many people were explicitly running as election denier candidates, and yet meekly conceded the defeat, at least relative to expectations. Sometimes there was a little bit of sour grapes in how they said it, but far more of those folks conceded in a timely way than I think we broadly expected. And we don't really know why. And I'll just say that, I'm not sure that the public survey data is necessarily the right way to think about that. That may have something to do with what's happening within Republican Party politics, the direction of the party as it shifts from being a Trump party to a Trumpist party, or, however you want to think about it. But there's something going on there that seems really important. And I just want to flag that I don't think we as experts have fully gotten our arms around that yet. And it's going to be something really important for us to figure out going forward, because we saw how destructive the opposite can be in the aftermath of 2020. We didn't see a repeat of that. It seems really important to understand the difference, right? We can tell stories about Trump himself, but now we had this distributed test of this across a bunch of different candidates. And with the exception of Kari Lake, no one followed in his path. And I think that's a very surprising result.
That's great. So I think also that helps answer Sandra Nispel asked, that there were a lot of experts warning about the likelihood that lots of Republican candidates would be unwilling to concede. That didn't happen. It sounds like we don't really know quite yet why that didn't happen. So I want to flag, we only have about 8 minutes left, but maybe briefly, so we have more questions than we can get answered, but I want to pull out a couple more. So Jennifer McCoy asks, per Brendan's earlier comment about potential causes of increased confidence in elections and Biden's legitimacy, do you have any data to indicate whether the January 6 hearings or other messaging or causes could be relevant? I know probably hard to get at with a panel of this sort, but I'd be curious to hear your speculations.
We didn't test it, but it's certainly one story. I think on the elite side, maybe that's a story about affecting candidate behavior, but I'd love to hear what my colleagues think.
Yeah, we didn't test that directly. We do have some data on the public's perceptions about January 6th and whether Trump committed a crime in January 6th and whether he should be prosecuted. And that data, which we had in Wave 17, so it's out there, it looks a lot like the partisan split for the impeachment proceedings, right? With about 90% of Republicans thinking he didn't commit a crime in the January 6th in January 6th, and about 90% of Democrats thinking he did and that he should be prosecuted for it. So we have a huge partisan split there, but the independents are about equally divided in terms of what they thought about January 6th. So I think that's going to be a very important and polarizing issue going forward, how the special counsel handles the prosecution of Trump. But I don't know yet how it played out in the 2022 midterms.
The one other thing I'll add to that, we asked these questions in Wave 17. This was the October wave, about whether people thought Trump had committed a crime in different situations. One was around the events around January 6th, and then second, should he be prosecuted? And a couple things to observe there. One, there was almost no difference. I anticipated that even many people who thought he had committed crimes would say, well, no, prosecution isn't a good idea, and that there'd be a gap between those responses. There was almost no gap among anybody, Democrats or Republicans or independents. If they thought a crime had been committed, they said they thought prosecution should happen. But another key thing here, and this gets to Brendan's point about elite messaging. We asked the question two ways. We asked them just as a yes, no, you got to say yes or no on this question. And then we also asked them with a I don't know option. And I think it was around 15% or so, maybe 15 to 20%, when presented with that, took the I don't know option. And if you look at the overall results, that dropped us from a sort of a solid majority in favor of prosecution to about 40%. And I think that's important because these are really complicated issues. You know, the sort of the Trump's legal status with respect to January 6th, all kinds of issues about election integrity. And, you know, when we force people to say yes or no, they're going to give us an answer. But when you give them the option to say, I don't know, I think that's the group that is going to be most careful, most swayed by what elites in their party are saying. And I think, you know, we got to be careful not to underestimate the degree to which elite messaging is going to matter on the margin.
Great. So let me pose. Yeah, go ahead.
I'm sorry. Could I add one more thing, which is, and this is sort of goes back to the original question about, you know, the ideological bias of the experts. The one group where the more of them thought that he had committed a crime but were reluctant to prosecute were the experts on the issue of the documents at Mar-a-Lago. So there was some support for exercising some kind of forbearance among experts. You know, that said, we also fielded a question about whether they thought prosecuting Trump generally would be beneficial for democracy. And I think it was 70% wave 17. And then just looking at the results here, it's actually gone up to 76%. But at least on that documents issue, there was some gap between committing a crime and prosecuting that was notable among experts.
Right. All right, so let me ask one more question that we'll have to answer relatively quickly, and it builds on Tom Carroll's question here, but I want to reframe it slightly. So Tom asks, I haven't had the benefit of your past research, and I'm struggling with the term performance of democracy. Can you offer additional explanation of your definition of this? I'd be especially curious to hear if you have any sense of what respondents mean when they talk, you know, so when you ask them, what's the quality of democracy going to be in 5 or 10 years? Do you have any sense of what they have in mind when they answer a question like that?
I'll answer briefly and let my colleagues follow. I think people have different notions in mind, and we're open to that. So the way we've structured our surveys is we ask people about these more concrete performance indicators that I think Gretchen referred to, how well American democracy is performing in specific areas, and those are hopefully more specific. And then we have this global measure, and I mean global in the sense of being overall on a 0 to 100 scale, asking people how well they think American democracy is performing, and that's capturing their overall thoughts about democracy, however defined. And part of our goal, actually, as a kind of hybrid of expert and public perceptions, is to bring those together and think about how experts are thinking about American democracy versus the public, and how those sometimes differ. I think it is a loosely understood term, and that's always a challenge for us in interpreting these results.
Okay, so we are just about out of time. I don't know if John and Gretchen, you guys want to add anything to Brendan's comments there. If not, I'll just say a huge thank you to everyone in the audience for coming and being a part of this today. Apologies that we couldn't get through all of the excellent questions that you all asked. Sandra's asking when this report is going to be published on Brightline Watch. Is this coming imminently, one of these days soon?
I'm going to go out on a limb and say within a week.
Yeah. Look for it next week.
Sounds like a promise to me.
Follow us on Twitter if you want to see when it's posted, or check the website, brightlinewatch.org.
Okay, yeah. So please keep an eye out for that report coming online soon. So thanks again to everyone in the audience. Huge thanks to Gretchen, John, and Brendan for sharing this incredibly important work with us. You guys are really doing a tremendous public service and helping us all think through the challenges that we're facing as American citizens. So thank you to the panel, thank you to the audience, and keep an eye out for that report coming online soon.